curators, Ernest Bryant, Ernest Hardy and Tisa Bryant.
Hi, good evening,
Thank you guys for coming out.
and for sticking around.
So we're going to, I'm going to let Tisa.
Oh, we were just talking about how moving this is. Like, the end is like so emotional. Since we've been doing this series, the Black Book, this one for Hustle and Flow, and looking at Black work and labor, we wanted to just start off by talking about the labor of making the film itself. So, Ernest's got some things to say about that.
So this was F. Gary Gray's second film. His first was Friday, which was a huge hit, and he was looking for a follow-up, and this was it. But even though Friday was a huge hit, he got a really small budget. He was given $9 million. That was his budget, and a shooting time of 39 days. And when you look at this film, if you know anything about filmmaking, $9 million, especially for what he did, is pretty astonishing. And 39 days to do this as well is like nothing. So I'm always kind of blown away by how really spectacular this film is, given that it was a shoestring budget and no time to make it. What was also interesting is the way he sort of embedded a lot of texture just in the casting of the film. Queen Latifah was Queen Latifah, already like a legendary rapper, was filming the TV show Living Single.
Living single.
Living Single. As she made this, Jada Pinkett already had a lot of like currency from being in like Minister Society and on a different world, so she had a lot of like cultural currency that she brought to the table. Blair Underwood was like the heartthrob of the moment. Then you have people like Anna Maria Horsford, who wasn't necessarily ever a huge mainstream figure, but for Black filmgoers, Black film fans, she was a hugely well-known actress. And then you have
For TV as well. Yeah.
Right. And then you have people like Dr. Dre, who as an actor is weak, I think we can all agree, but he was Dr. Dre, right? So at this moment, Dr. Dre was the equivalent of like Kanye or Drake or whoever's having their Twitter beef this week. Dr. Dre was the equivalent of that at the time, so there was just a lot of really smart casting choices that sort of embedded the film with a certain
Vivica
kind of
Fox
cachet.
also, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, is Booty Call out?
Well, it's interesting. F. Gary Gray said that he requested that Vivica Fox come and audition for this role, and that she actually had to like take a break from shooting Independence Day, which she'd been acting for a minute, but Independence Day was like the thing that really put her on the map. So this was sort of like a 1-2 punch for her to be working on Independence Day, and then to be filming this at this, to snare the role for this, like sort of back to back. So, how many of you are familiar with the Bechdel test? Oh, most
Okay.
of you. Well, for those of you who aren't, the Bechdel test is basically 3 questions. And the first question is, are there 2 or more women characters in the film who actually have names? Believe it or not, that is not always the case. Do the 2 women talk to each other? And then do they talk about something other than a man?
And I should just interject that the Bechdel test, for those of you who don't know, Alison Bechdel, the cartoonist and graphic novelist, kind of made these observations about Hollywood films and kind of came up with the Bechdel test and these 3 questions.
Right. And I think the last thing, just like sort of to talk about the craftsmanship and the making of the film, is to put it in a sort of cultural and political context. They referenced the film Thelma and Louise in this film, and Thelma and Louise came out in 1991. And one of the things that was interesting about Thelma and Louise, there were all these articles written when it came out, was that one of the most supportive demographics of the film was Black women, which was something that studio heads and people involved with the film hadn't expected. But Thelma and Louise really resonated very much with Black women. And so you can sort of see the DNA, if you would, of Thelma and Louise in this film. It's also important to note that the 1992 rebellion, riot, uprising, whatever term you prefer, also is sort of coursing throughout this film at the same time. And I think, one of the things that makes this film both moving and at times hard to watch is when we see both with Stoney's brother and then with Cleo, when we see just like this barrage of bullets, at these, black people. I don't like the term black bodies because it kind of, black people. And it just reminds us that for black people, this was not news, right? I mean, this was something that was a given. And so the films, from 1996, and here we are in 2018, just sort of reminds a lot of folks that the newscast that we see, the phone footage that we see of black people being, just sort of bombarded with bullets, as black people have been saying forever, is an age-old component of black life in this country.
And also, too, it's really important for 1996 to think about how rap and hip hop has become, a kind of a global titan of music, and some of the glamorization of gangsters, guns, crime, and for all of the reasons that anyone might take these kinds of desperate measures to support themselves and their families and change their material circumstances, to put women at the center, to put black women at the center of that kind of mythologizing. While it in part was played for laughs, that Godfather scene also did something really important that hadn't happened before for black women in rap and hip hop. That kind of, gets additional credibility from the presence of Dr. Dre and, of course, having Latifah at the lead. At that time, it was a really big deal when this film came out. And the other thing about the making of the film that I find really striking with that is how F. Gary Gray shows the schisms of class and mobility within this film amongst black people. You have characters like Ella Joyce, who plays the detective. Anna Maria Horsford is the Child Protective Services social worker. I was like, what is that job? And then Blair Underwood, being at the head of a bank against these four. And the interplay between those characters is really important to consider that at the time where, in the media, there's a lot of hyping up of the rise of the black middle class. There's shows like The Cosby Show and A Different World, Frank's Place. There were so many shows at the end of the 80s and into the 90s that were really kind of vaunting this sense that, all of the problems of poverty and lack of resources and all manner of disparities had somehow miraculously been taken care of. And this film kind of peels that back and shows from the very beginning of it that, that's not the case at all, and that all of these people are actually have their lives intertwined and, have from very different vantage points.
And just to build on that, what the film also does that's really interesting and still incredibly rare is to discuss class rage and class anger through the experiences of black women. For me, one of the things that's really interesting is the character of Frankie. When we see her in the beginning and she's working in the bank, what we're seeing is, the flip. We're seeing the code switch, right? And Frankie's rage and her, desire to rob these banks is probably as much to do with saying fuck you and fucking over the system that fucked her over as it is financial, because Frankie's that black person who learned to code switch. Frankie's that black person who got up every morning and pulled down the corporate drag, and put on the demeanor, learned how to talk, small talk with the white girl, to pass the time and everything, jumped through all these hoops, and when push came to shove, she was still this like racialized problem who had to be dispensed. And so Frankie's rage is really interesting. in that way, and the um, to sort of flip from rage to the nature of work itself, and the very like gendered kind of work itself, although it doesn't have to be. When Stoney sleeps with the creepiest character on screen in the film, when she sleeps with him to get the funds for her brother, it's really interesting. I think a lot of people when they think of sex work, think of someone who works as an escort or works on the street over for a period of time. I think a lot of people don't think of sex work as something that a lot of folks, men and women, gay, straight, whatever, engage in at some point. It might be something you only did once, but you did it because you had to eat. You did it because you had to pay rent this one time, whatever. And to just like sort of weave that in without judgment. But it's very, it's a reality, and it's a reality especially when you're poor, when you don't have a lot of options, to have to turn to sex work. And I think even though Stoney isn't shown having the kind of rage that Frankie does, I think if we're talking about like rage and class rage based on having a lack of option, we have to weave in when you have to fuck someone you really don't want to fuck in order to meet some goal. So all of that is sort of in play in this.
And I like the way that you said that, because that you fuck somebody that you really don't want to fuck in order to not get fucked. It's kind of the way I think about assimilation generally, and what you were talking about in terms of code switching, what Frankie goes through, that Stoney then has to learn. Or she doesn't have to learn it, but that's kind of part of, we can call it the pretty woman montage, right? Blair Underwood as Richard Gere, right? But it's very different. So it's interesting too to think about this film intertextually, like how it's commenting on Hollywood, and what that means to put Black women in those positions, and how some of these well-worn tropes of Hollywood storytelling get turned on their head. And I really like Stoney's character, even though I had some kind of questions about, because that storyline is kind of hung on her, and she's the one that survives and goes through very interesting transformation for what we see of it, taking her extensions out, and, her hair's natural, and, she gets to drive up the coast above an ocean. Yeah, but the cost of that is kind of outside of the frame of the film.
I wanted to, what you were saying about Pretty Woman, one of the things that's interesting is, she has the Pretty Woman princess makeover, right? Mm-hmm. But both Stoney and the movie, build in a critique of that trope, when Blair Underwood's character, Keith, says to her, do you feel free now, right? And she says, well, I feel free now, but it's not my life. It's borrowed from pieces of yours. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just like 2 lines, but it just like immediately, sort of, when you're in the audience and you're watching that makeover and you're watching her in this dress and the whole thing, and it's really lovely, and she just like sort of throws a glass of water in your face as the viewer. It's like, this is a moment, and it doesn't really have anything to do with my life, and it's not going to change my life.
And yet she wants it to.
Right.
She has that whole conversation with Cleo, when Cleo's saying, like, Hollywood, Beverly Hills, Thousand Oaks, what do I know about that? Doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm from here. This is where I belong. And Stoney was just like, why do we have to accept that? And they have that whole exchange, and Cleo in the end is like, I don't care. This is where I belong. And Stoney's already, and she always had aspirations. And that's another interesting, I kept thinking of Boys in the Hood as well. If we're going to talk about tropes and things like, and how dreams get stolen, not just deferred, but just canceled. That the possibility for mobility through school was all on her brother, and she was willing to do anything to kind of make that happen. And it's horrible that not only did it turn out that she didn't need to trick with that dude to get them, some money for the tuition. But he ends up dead, in the I don't even know what the movie time actually was. You barely have like a couple of days, it seems, to kind of process that before this. It's just like a steamroller of horror that rolls through all of these women's lives, and makes the stakes really high. They're not just doing this just to do it. And so the precarity of their situation, and having to kind of go back and do this again and again. It's interesting, unlike, what we're talking about, sex work and Stoney, actually ended up needing to rob a bank 3 times, not just the one time.
What you were saying about school and that being the way out, I really loved when, before Stoney finds everything out and she's sitting on the bed with her brother and she says, we made these plans and we are going to do this. And it really just spoke to the way in which, quite often for black people, for a lot of black and brown people, period, the one who goes to college, there's so many dreams and and hopes riding on that person's back. There's so many sacrifices that are made for that person to have that opportunity. And, on the other side of that is, if you go to school and if you do, get the degree and a good job, we can talk so much about one of the reasons that there is so little forward movement in terms of black people having generational wealth is because quite often the one who goes to school and the one who gets the job then has to support a cousin or a sister or niece or nephew. And so the opportunity to have money to put in, to invest, to build your stock portfolio just doesn't really exist. And so when Stoney's disappointment, we can sort of expand it a little bit and look at the brothers lying to her and his not getting in school as like a sort of domino effect of so many dreams and so many hopes is sort of like tumbling over.
And starting with her parents. Right? Their parents were killed.
We were talking in the back about the fact that Ursula, Cleo's girlfriend, never says a word.
Okay, so that part of the Bechdel test, I would need to add an addendum to the Bechdel test about that. And when I first saw this film in San Francisco, with a bunch of black and brown lesbians, we were furious. This is like, can she not? Okay, this is like, was there there was no line in the budget to give this sister just one line? Even the sister that cut Stoney's brother's hair and put the AP in, she got a line. She was only in the film for 2 scenes. She got a line. Ursula, who is in maybe 6, 7 scenes, she's utterly silent. She's fine, but she's utterly silent the entire time. I still don't understand that decision at all. Why she had to be, wow.
But and that's not a small thing at all, but one of the things that I think the film gets right is that Cleo is one of the most magnetic characters in the film. In fact, Jada Pinkett, apparently, when the script was sent out and she showed interest in the film, she wanted to play Cleo because she thought Cleo was the most interesting, rich character, and F. Gary Gray had to sort of talk her into playing Stoney. But what I do love about Cleo is, you have this queer character who provides much of the film's comic relief without being the film's comic relief. Mm-hmm. She's not a joke. Mm-hmm. She and she has many layers. I mean, piggybacking on something that Tisa said before, when Stoney and Cleo are sitting on the stairs and they're talking about Hollywood and getting out, and Cleo's like, I'm a hood rat. This is where I am. You realize that beneath all of her swagger, there's a kind of resignation, and then that resignation, it turns into a kind of fatalism, which we see in that really just heartbreaking suicide drive that she does. Because we all know that she's not going to make it, right? And so there's just these really wonderful, all these multiple notes that Queen Latifah as an actress strikes in that character and brings up all these layers. And I also have to really applaud F. Gary Gray because I think that, a film director can't really do much about the homophobia of an audience. I mean, there's only so much you can do. But I do think that if the director has a kind of progressiveness of vision and has a kind of empathy that he or she extends to queer characters, I think that comes through in the movie. And yeah, the homophobes are probably going to still be homophobic, but I think people who might not necessarily be homophobic, or maybe those who more easily led to participate in group homophobia, are given pause because you see a multi-dimensional, multi-layered character, a multi-layered human being. Yeah. And I think F. Gary Gray and Queen Latifah in unison really gave us that in Cleo.
Yeah, and absolutely. There's no opportunity that the director gives you in the film to engage as a homophobe. If you're going to do that, that's on you outside of the film. There's no moment in this film that anybody says anything to Cleo, which is surprising because you'd think it would happen immediately, but it doesn't happen at all. And I am glad that F. Gary Gray talked Jada Pinkett into playing Stoney. She's great in it. She's tough, and we were talking she was little badass mama, She just she slapped Cleo. If you ever put a gun in my face again, I was like, whoa. She was always on them like that. And it's great character development because she basically was that to her brother. And it kind of followed in everything that she does as a character. And I'm glad not to see her be in a role that I couldn't believe her in. Kind of like Winona Ryder in Night on Earth, where she plays a taxi driver, and she's supposed to be this tough, scrappy, and she uses all these telephone books to get up to the steering wheel. And it was just awful. It's just that wasn't your role, and how come nobody talked you out of that? You could have been a different kind of cab driver. You're not tough. You're not, Jada would have been better. But yeah, this film, it has a lot of meat and gristle to it. Yeah.
So, do you guys have any comments or questions?
Yeah, the ushers will come around and give you the mic. We're not choosing.
Hello? Okay. So it was my first time seeing the movie. I can't believe I waited that long. It was very good. But for me, it was immediate takeaways. It was a Black liberation film. It was a feminist piece, and it was complete social commentary throughout the whole thing. For me, all I saw was four Black women wanting to be free and looking to get free in every way, and that's all I really took away was just Black women in America looking for freedom. And I don't know if it was on purpose, but what my final takeaway was, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, when at the end when Stoney's ends up in Mexico and she's riding away and she's finally quote unquote free and she's found her freedom, it's not in America, and she had to leave the country to do that. And
it cost her everything.
And she also, I was just going to say, she also had to lose everything to do that, including everyone dying. So for me, it was Black women can't be free in America. That was my takeaway. Unfortunately, and it was very good. It was very violent.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is important that we see what an extraordinarily steep cost it is for Black women, for Black people to have anything approaching freedom. It's a blood cost. It's a blood cost. Anyone else?
The mic is.
Please wait for
the mic is coming around.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's interesting when the Black Panther soundtrack came out, and there were all these essays written on this amazing soundtrack and stuff. And this is one of the things that happens when our cultural critics have memory banks that go back no further than 5 years.
It's true.
The 90s. All these amazing black films had these amazing soundtracks. I mean, the soundtracks were an art unto themselves. The soundtracks were, something that you lived with. Sometimes they dropped before the movie came out, sometimes they dropped the week of, but they took on lives of their own. And there are so many. I mean, there are soundtracks. I'm thinking of like the soundtrack to the movie Above the Rim, which the movie itself no one really even talks about anymore, but the soundtrack is a classic. And there are so many amazing, amazing soundtracks, and they were so carefully put together. I mean, yes, you wanted to get the hottest rapper, you wanted to get the hottest R&B singer, but it was, you had people like F. Gary Gray who really made sure that the music was a character itself, and that the music served the story, and the music served the characters, and and so this was all happening before Black Panther, But yeah, the soundtrack is definitely a character in its own right.
Hi. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, weird. Okay. First off, thanks for screening this film. This is like one of my favorite films ever. And I think the first time I saw it, I was maybe 13 or 14. But I don't really have a comment or a question as much as maybe a comment that you guys might talk about. So this is the first time I've watched the film and been really aware of the fact that it's based in Los Angeles, because I moved to LA like 4 years ago, and this is the first time I've watched it since moving here. But it seems like a film that's not really fetishizing or over aestheticizing LA scenery. Like, you don't really see palm trees until, at least I don't remember seeing one until like an hour and a half into the film. But you do see a lot of like urban environments that feel very much like it's like South LA. So there's like normal trees. It's really gritty. You're in alleyways. And also downtown LA, which is a lot of like skyscrapers, and then those sweeping like aerial shots of the corporate buildings that they're working inside of. So I was wondering if maybe you guys had any thoughts about those spaces or the representation of spaces.
Yeah, we were talking a bit about that backstage, actually. In fact, so much of what is presented in the film as being South LA is actually Hollywood or downtown itself. I think it's easy. It was easier for those parts of downtown, those parts of Hollywood, to sort of pass as South Central or South LA because they weren't yet gentrified, right? And so there's a kind of weatheredness, there's a kind of lived-inness I mean, there's one shot where they're supposed to be like in a bank in South LA, and it's actually right down the street from the downtown public library, And if you don't know LA, you wouldn't know that, and it's not that big a deal, but it just also really speaks to the ways in which the city itself has changed. There's no way that what is currently Hollywood or currently downtown LA could pass for anything except what they are. So there's a way in which the film also serves as something of a time capsule of the changes that the city of LA itself has undergone in the 20 years since the film, 20 plus years since the film was released.
And also, too, as someone I'm also not from here. I've been here almost 10 years. So, but being from the East Coast, seeing films and TV and knowing nothing about LA, it's easy to believe the cinematic mythology of Los Angeles. That glittering B-roll you're talking about, right? The sweep of beaches and the palm trees, and then the glimmering facades of the skyscrapers. Oftentimes, a lot of films that are, not a lot, but a number of films that are set here are not about Black people or Black life. So I always remember the first time I realized how urban LA was, and I was watching that show, The White Shadow. And I'll be honest, it actually broke my heart because, I could not deal with the fact of palm trees and projects. I didn't know that happened here, right? That wasn't part of the fantasy of LA, of Hollywood. I don't know what I thought, folks with not a lot of money, how they lived here. But I thought it had nothing to do with how I was living in Roxbury. Like, no, but that's exactly what it was. And so I actually really, even though there are all those kind of fake outs that always happen in Hollywood films where, if you know where they're supposed to be, you can kind of track it and see that's wrong. The fact that there was no kind of, we didn't need an overt glamorization of Los Angeles or Hollywood to understand the lives of these four women. We didn't need that contrast. Like, they knew what it was, but that the director didn't waste any time shooting that to kind of show us the discord and how people were living. Like, we got it just from their need of money, from their material conditions, from their dreams, and where they were living, and what LA looked like to them. I thought that was really important.
Something else that's also interesting about the film is I think a lot of people don't realize that there was a time when, like the cleaning crews for buildings and the work crews for a lot of buildings were largely black folks. And that demographic has obviously shifted quite a bit to the point that, if you were shooting a similar film today, the work crew would be largely Latino, if not all Latino. And so when we're talking about labor, we also have to talk about what that demographic shift has meant for black people. And the film also illustrates that when the four women are on the roof and they're looking across at this sort of ramshackle industrial site, and they're talking about the ways in which there was a time when we could have gotten jobs over there and they would have been $15 an hour. That was just like, that was a blue collar working class gig, but it was one that afforded a lot of families stability and mobility, right? And so when those jobs are gone, the repercussions, the domino effect, was really devastating. So there are all these like really quick but potent sketches in the film as well. Anyone else?
I just want to say something about the soundtrack. Hey. That is the same music supervisor that did Love Jones, the late, great Pilar McCurry. So she was astute at telling stories. And to your point, back then, if you could afford it, you just put all the hits in the soundtrack. Sometimes the soundtrack was better than the film.
Absolutely.
But yeah, Pilar McCurry. I also want to say I thought there was a really interesting hierarchy in the bank, because you had Blair Underwood, who also worked at the bank, and Vivica, but he sat upstairs and she was downstairs. And I thought it was interesting that sort of the difference between them was education. He kept talking about college. And these were two black people that worked in the bank, but two different classes of black people. His meetings were upstairs. At the end, he was upstairs taking a call. And when she got fired, she was sort of on the main floor. And I thought I thought her goal of robbing the banks was to hurt him in the pocket. I didn't think she was attracted to the outcome as much as she was sending a message that you fucked me, I'm gonna fuck you back.
Absolutely.
And because how you're keeping me down is money, and so how I'm gonna pay you back is by taking your money.
I'm glad you said that too, because that scene is so striking, that she is covered in blood, traumatized, and there's just she's just immediately a suspect, and there's not any moment where her trying to explain, she was trying to stop somebody that she knew from doing something crazy that could get him killed and everybody else, that moment of recognition actually meant something. Done. Couldn't see it. And that what did she say? I've counted $200,000 in here. I've been in here counting your money. I didn't take any of it. I've been here, been working. And yeah, this is how you do me? Okay.
I really love her line when she says, "I can't help who I know."
Right.
I mean, it's just such a layered, rich line. But before I go on, I wanted the last person who spoke. I'm going to embarrass her, and can we get her the mic again, please? I'm embarrassing her because this is the great Morgan Rhodes, who is just like a music. Any question you have about music, Morgan can answer it, and talk just a little bit. Tell them to check, the podcasts that you have, and sell yourself.
Thank you, Ernest. I have a podcast called Heat Rocks, which is a DJ term for a hot record. And it is a show about musical discovery. We sit down with artists, writers, and scholars, and we talk about canonical or seminal albums or albums that profoundly influenced them. And one of our guests was actually Ernest, who blessed us by coming on to talk about Sade's Love Deluxe. And he really, really, really killed it. We asked the same 10 questions of our guests, but he really broke it down to a level that we're still talking about today. And then I had envy because I've never actually seen Sade live, so he brought up a lot of jealousy and envy because he made me want to have had that experience, and I hadn't.
I did not single her out so she would mention me, I promise you. Anyone else? Comment, question? There's someone down here, unless he's just stretching.
He is not stretching. He is like, give me the mic.
Thank you for the film. That was very good. I've never seen the film, and I also was touched by a lot of the, right off the bat with murder and like the topic and everything. But on the subject of the environment or the place where it took place, I thought it was also interesting that the rooftop scene, I'm from Los Angeles, so it definitely was not like a LA piece. I think it applied more nationally by keeping the setting very, there was the shot from the roof of the oil, it looked to me like an oil factory. Didn't feel like LA, it was probably San Pedro maybe. And so there's also that comment of the environment kind of, where these neighborhoods are and how, the environment is also, they're talking about how great of a job it would be to work there, and it's like spewing out smoke, and I don't know if you maybe have a comment about that.
Well, I mean, I don't know exactly where that scene was shot, but there was industry in Los Angeles, and that was where black folks for decades did support themselves. So I don't know where that scene was shot, but it was definitely nodding toward a very LA specific narrative for black people and possibility, financial possibility, class possibility.
But I will say, though, I think if I understand what you're commenting on, there is something architecturally that gets framed in the film that for someone not from here, maybe from certain towns in the Midwest or from the East Coast, the fact that most of the houses that we see, not all of them, are wood frame, shingled, Victorian style homes, to the point where when I went out to see some film about a black and a Mexican person getting married or whatever, and there was a scene that to my cousin who's lived here for 22 years looked like it had to be on the East Coast or somewhere else. She said, there's no way that's LA. And I was like, no, I bet that's LA. I see houses like that. I see deciduous trees that are not palms. I see all kinds of stuff here, so there's a way that if you don't notice other details that tell on LA, that a scene like that could be a kind of ubiquitous American scene of Victorian houses, peaked rooftops and industry in the distance. I get that. Yeah.
Anyone else? No? Well,
There's one more over here. And this can be the last one.
yeah.
Ursula not speaking in the film, I guess I could see it as something of an affront, but I'd like to offer a different perspective. The character of Cleo, I remember when the film came out, and there was press for like a year about Latifah's tour de force at this character, and it was Oscar worthy. She was amazing. But I think just getting back to like the character of her girlfriend not speaking, what Cleo's character represented to me, like you talked about that glittering B-roll, I think that everything that Cleo's character valued, like when we think about quote unquote hood films and how they can be devalued, I think she brought all of that back to value. Like her saying, this is where I'm from, but this is my life. But I just saw her as having a lot of pride in who she was. And her girlfriend kind of being silent and blonde and sexy, I think what that said to me is that, like you talked about tropes. Like usually it's a white male, like a James Bond character that can kind of inhabit all of this objectification of women and guns. So I saw her kind of as like a hood flip side of that, taking all of, and her being a black woman queer character is awesome because she kind of took all of those things, the rims, all of the excess and all the things that kind of the culture, it became valued because hip hop became like mainstream music and now everybody wants that. But at that time, that wasn't the case. Like people considered that very ghetto. But to her, I think that she really, her character was just very much a celebration of what like South Central LA and things that were considered déclassé and worthless. And she was saying, hey, this is who I am, I claim it. And I thought it was beautiful.
So are you saying that then justifies Cleo having a silent black blonde trophy girlfriend because it's trophy femme because she's a black stud?
I'm not gonna say justifies, but I think that like you said, other films, Pretty Woman kind of play in it. To me, it's like a James Bond thing. It's like I can have the sexy blonde silent girlfriend. To me, it just was kind of a play on all of the things that white men and that archetype are allowed to do, but in her setting, in where she was from.
You know, I'm going to have to push back on that a little bit because
Okay.
I don't think Cleo was a reclamation of that from white men. I think if anything, it was like the video hoes that we saw in hip hop videos of that time, and still, you know, where you see cisgender heterosexual black men and their arm candy, you know. So I think Cleo's models were less James Bond or the white men than black male rappers and the way they treated women and the fact that women were simply, ornament,
It doesn't, I think it's a misstep. It doesn't, I would love to, it's not the big question that I would have. Well, maybe it is the big question I would have for F. Gary Gray. Like, why didn't she talk? What happened? Because I don't get it. To put 4 black women at the forefront of this film, was that like a study in contrast that, she's got, no dreams, nothing to say. All she wants is to, be with Cleo and get, money showered on her, and that's it. She shows up quite a bit. I get that part, what you're saying about value. I totally understand it as this kind of extension of, kind of Cleo's sense of herself and her desirability. But yeah, no, it's actually, it's indicative of a lot of things that were going on at the time in '96 for sure. And hip hop was absolutely becoming the center of the universe musically. That was happening in '96. But yeah, I just don't buy it.
It also would have been great because it was obvious that the other women, Frankie and Stoney and Titi, didn't have any problem with Ursula. They weren't homophobic, whatever. So it would have been just like an aside, just to, another layer in the group dynamic, how they, responded to or whatever Ursula. Other than, Frankie's really great line at the very beginning when Frankie's like, "She don't speak,"
Yeah.
which little did we know that would be the case throughout the film.
Yeah, maybe it's some joke we don't get. There's some inside thing.
So.
I'm sorry, I did see someone with a hand up. Is there room for one final question then?
Yeah, I guess my question was to reference that joke that was made, because the film is just so impressive with the efficiency at which like one or two lines point to an entire like the reference you made about the sort of like the pretty woman, like her tearing that down with just like a few lines. And I couldn't help but think that them commenting on the fact that she doesn't speak feels like something more than it feels like it's pointing it out in a way. It's still frustrating that the queer relationship doesn't have the same like like dimension as the other relationship, like the other
Frankie,
love interest.
Yeah,
Stoney and Keith.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
we're set up to have this parity between, in this film, to have this parity between a queer relationship and a straight relationship, hetero relationship, and they sort of dropped the ball on that. And as Tisa said, just one line.
I mean, we barely hear her laugh audibly. That's the only time you even hear like this aspiration, like anything, literally, and But it may be, a very terrible commentary on the video hoe, But like, it's one thing to do that one time. If we'd only seen Ursula once, and that happened, okay. But throughout the film, mm-mm.
So I think that's it. Thank you guys for coming
Thank
out,
you for
especially on a
coming.
Thursday night. Thank you.